Timothy Ash has been arguing for more than 18 months that the $300 billion plus of Russia's central bank assets be immobilized in Western jurisdictions and be formally frozen, seized, and allocated to Ukraine, both to compensate it for the immense damage done by Russia to Ukraine, but also to give it a chance to be able to fund the war, secure victory, and the subsequent peace and reconstruction. Welcome to Silicon Curtain Podcast. If you like the materials we create, please do engage with the videos by liking, subscribing, sharing, and do add comments. It really does help. Also, please check out the validated Ukrainian charities that are listed in the description of the video. They do tremendous work with veterans, and with sort of civilian causes to help keep Ukraine in the fight and to help keep it resilient. Timothy Ash has been a professional economist for more than 30 years, with 2/3 of that in the banking industry. Timothy's specialism is emerging European economies, and he writes and blogs extensively on the economic challenges for leading publications such as the Kyiv Post, Atlantic Council, Financial Times, and United Business Journal. He is also an associate fellow in the Russia and Eurasia program at Chatham House and has advised various governments on Ukraine-Russia policy, and specifically on the impact of sanctions. Timothy, welcome back to the channel.
My pleasure.
And if people enjoy this, they can catch our 3 previous conversations, and I highly advise them to do that because there's some brilliant information in those. Let's start, however, with the rather interesting news of Valery Zaluzhny being posted as the Ukraine ambassador to the UK. Now, some people in Ukraine are looking at this very much through the lens of internal politics, that, they're getting Zaluzhny out of the way, and this is a sort of backwater promotion. I suspect that it's much more than that, with potentially Trump in the White House and an onus on Europe to perhaps enter more of a leadership role in defense and supporting Ukraine. Do you think the move of bringing Zaluzhny to Britain is really much more strategic than just a sort of internal political sleight of hand?
Well, there's perhaps some of that going on as well. I mean, obviously, people have highlighted the potential challenge from Zaluzhny to Zelensky in the future, but I think UK is a really important position. UK has often led, particularly in terms of military support for Ukraine, and Zaluzhny will be welcomed certainly in London. It will reflect the importance of the UK-Ukrainian relationship. Obviously, we were the first to sign that long-term kind of strategic relationship with Ukraine. Other European countries have followed suit. And I guess there's been a long time since the previous ambassador was sidelined. It's been drifting a bit. It's great to have someone in that seat, and someone who's such a heavyweight as Zaluzhny is a positive in my mind.
And there's a lot going on, isn't there? We're going to touch on a couple of these topics, which may well be, helped by having someone senior, forceful, action-led like Zaluzhny, rather than a sort of, a backroom manager, as it were. And we're going to touch on things like seizing the assets, central bank assets we mentioned in the introduction, but there's also debt relief, as well as all sorts of military coordination. So let's start touching on those and how. Let's start with the debt relief, because this is a new one on me. But what's the importance to Ukraine of keeping it in the fight by getting this debt relief secured?
Okay, so in August 2022, creditors, official and private, agreed a 2-year debt service suspension for Ukraine to allow it to concentrate its financial resources basically on funding the war. The 2-year service suspension, certainly for the private sector, ends in August this year. The Paris Club official creditors, the debt service suspension actually extends till the end of 2027. Notable in terms of the IMF program that was agreed in late 2023. In the program document from December, essentially a financing package was put together for Ukraine of between 122 and 140 billion dollars for the period of 2027. The assumption in that program document was the contribution from debt relief will be about 14.8 billion, and the IMF suggested that a debt treatment with private creditors would be useful, and they've suggested they wanted to see an agreement with private creditors sometime in the early part of this year, but before August 24. It's a little bit, there are question marks around it. I've challenged the logic of doing that. The difficulties for the fund and for doing it, I mean, debt restructurings are usually pretty difficult, pretty complicated. They're framed around producing a macro framework and also a debt service analysis. I mean, essentially, and the driver for an early debt restructuring is the desire, I guess, to clear the decks, to bring Ukraine out of default and open the way for international capital market access for Ukraine much earlier than I think had been assumed. I mean, there's been suggestions of 2025. Actually, the IMF program, I think, only assumed 29 for funding, private sector funding or Eurobond funding for Ukraine. And the desire to go early, I think, reflects concern in the public sector that there's not enough official public sector money to support Ukraine. Obviously, Ukraine reconstruction needs are going to be huge, lots of different estimates. The latest one is well over 400 billion. And the assumption from the public sector, I guess, that the Western taxpayer will not be able to fund that, and the private sector is going to do some of the heavy lifting. Obviously, the London Recovery Conference last year and the other ones that we had, the Lugano, etc., focused on the private sector helping with the heavy lifting. The difficulty I see is that, and we have to be honest about this. The IMF program from December presented this financing equation, a financing gap for Ukraine of 122 to 140 billion. And there was assumption there that a large part of that would be met by the official sector, the Americans, the Europeans, etc. And there's big doubt now about that. Obviously, the 61 billion US financing package, which was supposed to take Ukraine up to the elections in the US and potentially a change of administration in the US, that's stuck in Congress, right? It's obviously stuck in the House. Real uncertainty about whether they gets done. And of that 122 to 140 billion financing package, 21 or 22 billion actually was supposed to come from the Americans. And that there's huge doubts now about that. And if Trump wins, whether US funding for Ukraine will continue. So, you go into a debt restructuring, we kind of get the logic, but the numbers have to add up. Ukraine will not have market access if it does a debt restructuring. Ultimately, that macro framework is not funded. And I have my doubts about whether the Europeans will be able to step up to fill the void left by US financing if that House package is not, that package in the House is not approved and Trump wins the presidency. So that raised the question, what's the point doing a debt restructuring at this point in time? Why not just wait until everything's clearer? Either the war ends or the funding story becomes clearer. Why rush when you're actually not going to get market access early with that? So there's some debate about it. I've also been very vocal about it. My basic point is, I don't think the financing equation works for Ukraine without using frozen Russian assets. Now, it's interesting, the IMF approaches this from a balance of payments fiscal perspective. It's very narrow focus. And, Ukraine has been getting around $40 billion a year to fill the budget shortfall. But you can't really ignore the broader financing requirement, the military fiscal support for Ukraine. It's running around $100 billion a year, roughly 40 fiscal, 60 military, of which half is provided by the Americans, right? And again, if that package doesn't get through the House, if Trump wins the election and pulls the money away, that leaves a huge financing shortfall. I'd say potentially $50 billion a year of the 100 billion. I don't think the Europeans can fill that. How are you going to fill that void? The only way realistically, to fill that void, I think is going after the 300 billion plus of frozen Russian assets. And we can certainly debate the issues around that. There are numerous, but the starting point for me has to be, you know, what does Ukraine need to function from a fiscal balance of payments perspective, but a military point of view? What is the cost, and how do we fill that? And I think the political reality. I mean, we may not like Trump, we may not like politics in the US, we may not like the direction of travel in terms of European politics. You know, we had Fico winning in Slovakia, we have Orban creating lots of different problems for the European Commission. We have Wilders in the Netherlands, whatever. What's key when you think of IMF programs, it's about the idea of financing assurances. You want donors to provide assurance that the money is going to come. The reality is, I don't think the fund can be assured that this money is going to come from Western taxpayers. They're big numbers. There's a global cost of living crisis. I don't think our politicians have explained adequately enough the importance of helping Ukraine win this battle. And we are where we are. There's a gap. There's a military gap. There's a financial gap. How are we going to fill it? The only way to fill that gap is by using frozen Russian assets. And if we are serious about helping Ukraine win this war, defeat Russia has to be defeated in this war. And we're serious about the successful recovery and reconstruction of Ukraine. The only way is using frozen Russian assets.
Well, we'll come on to assets in a minute, but I wanted to just make tangible what the gap in finances means. And of course, if the war drags on for another year, another 2 years, and there are some estimates that Russia could expend resources before goodness knows what, crashing out for another 2 years. This is a recent sort of investor, assessment that came out. Of course, that debt just grows, doesn't it? It's something that just will accumulate and accelerate over time. What's the practical impact in Ukraine in terms of frontline services, hospitals, fire crews, and so on? Does that mean the Ukrainian state cannot fund the essential services required to keep, cities and resilience going?
Well, look, in the end, on the fiscal point of view, the West's been providing $3 to $4 billion a month to pay the soldiers, to pay pensions, to keep the state functioning, to keep the war effort, enduring. I mean, the West provides a lot of military kit gratis, but paying the soldiers, really, a lot of that is funded through this financial support from Western countries. If it doesn't come, on the macro side, it means that Ukraine, probably the central bank will have to print money to fund the deficit. One of the big positives for Ukraine over the last couple of years, during the war, has been macro financial stability. Reflecting the fact that the West has provided gaps on the fiscal side. Also, that the reforms that were instigated in Ukraine since 2015, Ukraine now has a well-run central bank. The banking sector works well. The Ministry of Finance work well. Those kind of institutional reforms that were undertaken since 2015. So you've had macro stability. It's been one of the things we haven't had to worry about: devaluation, hyperinflation. Banks and money's worked. If this money doesn't go, if the Western financing doesn't continue, Ukraine has to print money to fund the deficit. We'll see macroeconomic instability, devaluation, hyperinflation makes fighting the war that much more difficult. And then on the military front, in the end, if the money doesn't come, it risks, military setbacks. It risks Russia pushing deeper into Ukraine. And then Ukraine's whole macro story, it means, Ukraine becomes less sustainable longer term. The more territory Russia takes, the more strategic assets, ports, railway infrastructure, all those kind of things it takes. It just becomes much more difficult. So in the end, the military balance, the military equation is important, but the financing is also important. I've been very vocal. I've argued that there's there's a military Ramstein process, a coordination on the military side. We don't really have that much on the financial side, I think. At the micro level, there is the donor coordination council, whatever. Top down, though, I don't think there's been enough focus on really making sure the numbers really add up. And I think we need more leadership there from Western countries. Ultimately, the US has to take that lead, I think.
And leadership, I think, is an interesting point here. So, if we go on to the topic of the 300 billion central bank assets, which seem to be critical from your argument in both keeping Ukraine in the fight and keeping financial economic stability, while not lumping all of those costs onto Western taxpayers. And of course, we know in the US, that is a huge trigger point within internal US politics. Avoiding that is a great advantage. What are the main arguments against it? Am I being unfair in characterizing them as being quite sort of academic, very managerial, bureaucratic kind of objections, or just inertia? It's easier to say, no, well, there are various reasons not to do it. Or do you think there are some genuinely sound reasons why we shouldn't unlock those assets and hand them over to Ukraine?
Well, the reasons we need to do it are obviously the moral argument that Russia is clearly responsible. In international law, it's invaded another country, violated its borders. I would argue it's committed genocide and war crimes. It needs to pay. Its rockets are clearly responsible for the damage done in Ukraine. I'd also argue that it's ridiculous, really, to think that Western Russia comes in, causes all the damage, and that Western taxpayers write a blank check for rebuilding it when we have cash, 300 billion plus, probably about $330 billion of Central Bank of Russia cash. It's there, ready cash to pay for it. I mean, that should be a scandal, actually, to be honest. And politically, it should be suicide for our governments that, our governments are spending our money in effect to defend Russian assets, to not spend them. That is just extraordinary. And actually now they're asking for a debt restructuring, debt relief. I mean, in the end, the creditors, the private sector creditors, who are they? I mean, in the end owners of this credit are pensioners. So it's Western pensioners that have been asked to provide debt relief or write-offs on the debts owed by Ukraine because our governments really don't want to do the thing that is quite difficult. I'd agree with that, but they don't really want to force Russia to pay. Remarkable. Now, the arguments used, the excuses, I would argue, are varied. One, it's the argument that, going after Russian assets is a risk to the dollar and the euro as reserve currencies. It undermines confidence more generally in the Western financial system. The argument is other authoritarian regimes, the Chinese, the Saudis, you name it, Gulf countries, will think the West's coming after their assets next, and they will move those assets, right? Well, so far, the assets have been immobilized. Russian assets have been immobilized. They've been put out of use from Russia. The Western governments have said Russia's never going to get them back, but they're not really willing to allocate them to Ukraine. The message has already been sent to those other authoritarian regimes that, if you invade other countries, you commit war crimes and genocide, your assets will be immobilized and put beyond your use. We
That's
haven't
not a
seen
bad thing,
any.
though, right? That's
Well, it's
quite
not
a
a bad thing.
powerful deterrence. Yeah.
Sure, and despite, I don't think there's a big difference between mobilizing and freezing and then allocating to Ukraine. We haven't seen any real movements of these other authoritarian, of their assets of these other authoritarian countries out of the dollar and euro. One of the reasons is, their stock of foreign exchange reserves is over 3 trillion. There's no real elsewhere for them to go, frankly, because they don't trust each other. There's no big liquid markets they can invest in. And look, bottom line is they haven't moved them. So I think that argument is very weak. I would argue for the euro in particular, a Russian victory in Ukraine is the worst thing for the euro. Actually, it's the worst thing for confidence in the euro. So we have to make sure Ukraine wins this war. Now, one of the other arguments is the risk of retaliation. That all these Western businesses who have operations in Russia, if we seize Russian assets in our jurisdictions, their own assets will be put at risk. Well, this is again a pretty ridiculous argument, in my view. So these Western companies made the wrong business call, the wrong investment call. They ignored all the evidence going back to perhaps the Russian invasion of Georgia in 2008, twice Russia using weapons of mass destruction on the streets of a NATO member, Litvinenko and Salisbury in the UK, annexation of Crimea, I mean, it was clear what the Putin regime was, and they stayed invested. They had opportunities to leave, and now what they're essentially saying is, oh, please, we don't want those frozen Russian assets taken because you'll go after our assets. We'd rather the Western taxpayer again bails them out. So the Western taxpayer is expected to bail these Western businesses out, greedy Western businesses that ignored advice, made windfall profits from Russia, and now Western national security interests are going to be put take a backseat for their financial a ridiculous argument, actually.
And
The third one.
oh, well, let's jump in on that one before we get to the one, because some of these businesses are still operating in Russia. Some of these businesses are still contributing, tens and tens of millions of dollars to the Russian treasury during the full-scale war, essentially, in my view, to support genocide, aggression, and fund the Russian war machine. Do you think that is a consideration here, that rather than having a bailout from taxpayers for essentially highly immoral behaviors, these companies in some ways deserve to be punished, not just for poor business decisions, but for funding genocide?
Well, they've been reluctant to leave so far. Presumably, they think that there's some future for these operations. The war's going to end, and they're going to go back to business as normal with the Putin regime. Some people just don't learn, right? And maybe we should be thinking of taxing these companies for continuing their operations, right? I mean, as you said, they are paying taxes to the Russian treasury. They are helping to fund the war. It's pretty disgraceful, right? Just going back, the third argument is this rule of law argument. And actually the legal difficulty that, laws don't particularly exist at the moment, etc. On the legal argument, I would say, well, look, in the US, we've seen prior examples of this happening. In Afghanistan, central bank reserves, Iraqi central bank reserves after the first Gulf War. In the end, in the US, it's an executive decision. The president can basically sign a decree or order doing it. That's the legal basis. It can definitely happen. Other jurisdictions, it requires parliamentary legislation, but it can be done. I mean, change the laws, do the laws. If we take this seriously, if we think Ukraine's defense and the defeat of Russia, stopping Russia's advance is important, and the defense of Western liberal market democracy is important, change the laws, right? I mean, do it to ensure Ukraine wins. And I would argue this sort of argument that somehow the rule of law in the West is this sort of we're a bastion of rule of law. Where was the rule of law when the money came in? Where was the rule of law when all this oligarchic, dirty Russian money was pouring in? Where was KYC, know your clients? And I think one of the problems is, banks and other institutions that facilitated and manage this money will say, well, this particular oligarch had a clean legal bill of health, right? He was never prosecuted for any. Well, obviously he wasn't, because Russia was a jurisdiction where there was no rule of law, right? And in the end, there's a lot of focus on corruption in emerging markets, etc. We have to recognize that Western jurisdictions have facilitated corruption and oligarchic theft for too long. We launder the money. It ends up in the City of London or Geneva or wherever it is, because we don't ask enough questions, or we don't set enough bars, or the default settings on jurisdictions like Russia, dodgy jurisdictions, are not set too high. And that's the problem. So I wouldn't get overly, romantic about the Western jurisdictions' prowess in terms of rule of law, because we are responsible for the rise of kleptocracy and the continuation of kleptocratic and oligarchic regimes like the Putin regime. In the end, we just have to get this done. We have to pass laws to make sure it happens, and it happens quickly. Unfortunately, many of the decisions, it's interesting, and I've been part of a campaign group on this issue. We go and meet politicians, and you tell them the story, and straight away it's absolutely, they say, well, this is obvious. Why are our taxpayers paying for this and Russia isn't? And they're very enthusiastic. I mean, I don't think I've met a Western politician yet who doesn't like this idea. And it then goes down a layer to treasuries and central banks the bean counters, and they find excuses not to do it. Those people should not be making the decisions. This is a national security issue. I don't think central bankers particularly know very much about national security. They weren't very good at predicting, Russia's invasion. They weren't very good at setting compliance rules around, the flow of money out of Russia as a jurisdiction into their own jurisdictions. Bottom line is, national security issue. It has to be done. We have to find the money. Western taxpayers shouldn't pay. Russia has to pay. Just get it done.
Dare I say, controversially, that there are potentially bean counters in positions of national security. I did a video last week where I analysed the speeches of Jake Sullivan. Now, we won't get into that, but the question here is one of the real problems here political will? Because if there was a strategy, if there was a will to get behind Ukrainian victory and define what that means, then the objections would perhaps melt away. But one of the problems here is no one is going to go and try to cut through all this bureaucratic inertia because there's no clear strategy for victory. Ukrainians have one, but there isn't really a consensus on this in Western capitals.
I always start my speeches around frozen Russian assets by turning the tables a little bit. And I argue that those people who argue against it, the bean counters, the people in central banks that, the computer says no, right? I challenge them. Okay, I get it may not be, it may not be want to be my plan A, but we are where we are. If you're not willing to do this, tell me how we are going to fund Ukraine. Tell me exactly. We know the numbers. The IMF said 122 to 140 billion dollars for a fiscal balance of payments to the period till 27. 100 billion a year in war, 50 billion dollars in peace. Tell me how you're going to fund this. And the numbers do not add up at the moment. We are not meeting Ukraine's military and financial needs. And so, if you're not willing to give me the numbers, an alternative, tell me how you will cope with Ukraine's defeat. What does Ukraine's defeat look like? And I will tell you what Ukraine's defeat looks like and its impact on Europe. Ukraine's defeat means Russian tanks progressing west, further onto NATO's borders, further threatening, further encroachment into the Baltic states, into Poland, etc. It means tens of millions of Ukrainians moving west. It means, and the result of that will be social, political instability, increase of populism, risks of, there is really a risk, I think, of wars in Europe. I mean, it's interesting, Orban has been very reticent about supporting Ukraine. You have to ask why that is. Does he have a greater Hungary strategy? If Ukraine fails, is he going to put a bid for Transcarpathia? You end up going to be lots of, historical conflicts in Europe inflamed by this. And actually, from a financial position, NATO will have to increase defense spending across the board by at least 1 percentage point of GDP. That is about $100 billion a year more. Interestingly, exists exactly the amount that needs to be to fund Ukraine to win the war. So if we fund them now, provide what they need, there's a prospect that Ukraine can win this war within the next year or 2 years. But if we don't, we're going to spend another $100 billion a year on defense recurring the next 10, 20, 30 years, as long as the threat from Russia remains. It's a no-brainer. But again, those people argue against don't kind of think this way. It's hiding behind weak legal arguments, weak arguments about reserve currency, etc. They don't give me the alternative. But your main point, I mean, in the end, what I struggle with, lots of Western politicians are very quick to get on train to Kiev and have a photo opportunity with Zelensky. Makes them look good at home. Unfortunately, I don't think there's very clear thinking about how important this war is in terms of making sure Ukraine wins it and Russia loses, and what it does mean for our national security. If our governments had taken the risk from Russia seriously, and the warnings from people like myself and the Russia and Eurasia program at Chatham House, we wouldn't be where we are. It worries me that the same people now are making these decisions. This should be our number one priority, winning this war, and we need to do everything we need. That we have to take the gloves off. Putin is an operator, right? He does sneaky things here and there. He pulls any trick he can to get advantage. We can't play by Queensberry rules. If we play by Queensberry rules, we will lose. So we have to think outside of the box. We have to think innovatively. But in the end, how are we going to fund Ukraine? How are we going to fund it? To ensure balance of payments, macro stability, and how are we going to fund the military machine in Ukraine to ensure it can defend itself and defeat Russia?
And let's presume that this is successful. And there are people like yourself, Bill Browder, and others who are pushing hard for this. And I think the logic is irrefutable. Let's say it happens. What kind of things can this pay? And we've talked about sort of, some of those sort of macroeconomic things. We've talked about, funding hospitals, emergency services, and so on. Can a portion of this be used to say, help fund the ammunition gap, help fund the gap in certain military requirements that are already seeing Ukraine lose territory and lose the opportunity to degrade Russian military assets?
Well, there's obviously been a lot of focus on using the money for recovery and reconstruction and reparations, and obviously lots of Ukrainians have suffered dreadfully at the hands of the Russian onslaught. And absolutely, they need to be compensated through a fair reparations process. But in the end, Ukraine has to win the war first. And I would say that given the uncertainties around US financing, the best way is to provide the Ukrainians with the money and allow them to fund their own defense. I mean, imagine, the problems in the Republican Party around Ukraine. Imagine if Ukraine had a $300 billion cash account in its balance sheet and was able to buy whatever military kit it wanted. It could go to the US and say, well, we'd like to spend $60 billion with US military kit. Even Trump, I think, and the Republicans would struggle to say no to that. So it gives Ukraine so many options, I think, if we do this. I mean, I think in a scenario where, we have to think long term also, assuming, the money is used, they fund their own defense, they end up defeating Russia. There are obvious questions about, how we manage the money. I've, again, been pretty vocal about it. I mean, I think we should think about it funding Ukraine's long-term recovery and reconstruction. The money, I think, should be invested. I think it's difficult for Ukraine. Let's assume 100 billion would be used for military. There's a couple of $100 billion left for recovery and reconstruction. Ukraine, it's a $200 billion economy. It's very difficult to absorb all that money in 1 year. You've got to assume that it's going to be spent over maybe a decade, say 50 billion a year, whatever. I think it would be wise to create a sovereign wealth fund style structure to manage the money with the aim of generating annual returns. It's not unreasonable to think something like a Temasek, that's a sovereign wealth fund in Singapore. It could generate returns of something like 10% a year, 10% on 200 billion, 20 billion, or if it's 300 billion, 30 billion. That goes a long way to supporting recovery and reconstruction. The sovereign wealth fund could be jointly managed by Western donors and Ukrainians. Obviously, there's lots of concern about corruption, all those kind of things in Ukraine. It can be an agent for reform in Ukraine. It has leverage because it has obviously a big cash assets. It can drive the reform agenda forward. It can be a partner for investment. It could also probably borrow on its own behalf, right? So to multiply up the value of the underlying assets. So, but maybe we're getting ahead of ourselves. Firstly, Ukraine has to win the war, and I think getting Ukraine a sizable chunk of that money is really important. I have to say, obviously the Europeans are focused on this idea of giving Ukraine the interest or the windfall interest earned on assets, for example, in Euroclear in Belgium. The problem with that is, I don't mind the idea, but the current returns, well, the assets are currently invested in low sort of safe haven assets, treasuries, bonds, all the gilts, all this kind of thing. It generates around $3-4 billion a year. It's not enough. It's not enough to fill that $40 billion budget financing gap and the $100 billion a year overall funding equation for Ukraine. Now, either You think innovatively, how you again, if the underlying assets remain in the ownership of Russia, but you're using the interest earned on those assets, then think innovatively, invest them in something else, invest them in a portfolio of emerging market assets paying 10%, issue Ukrainian bonds, use the assets to buy those bonds. Russia would remain the ultimate owner. That would perhaps make some of the legal obstacles of transferring ownership a bit less difficult. But again, we just need to think innovatively. If we allow the bean counters in our treasuries and central banks to make the decisions, Ukraine will lose, and we will lose. That's the fact.
And another idea that popped up this week is one that I barely got my head wrapped around. I didn't do so well at economics and A level. I have to sort of hand on heart there. But this is the idea of a bond issue that was announced by the British government. What is the proposal? How might it work? And could this actually have legs, this idea, to help plug some of these financial gaps talking about and accelerate the provision of essential military kit to Ukraine?
Well, I mean, different governments. I mean, the Canadians have borrowed on their own behalf, but for Ukraine with a sort of Ukraine bond. I'm not sure of the details, particularly of the UK scheme. I mean, Lee Buckheit, a famous emerging market lawyer, last week came out with an idea that has been suggested by many people, including myself, way back, is kind of collateralizing the assets on the behalf of Ukraine. I mean, there's lots of interesting structures you can think about to ensure that Ukraine gets the financing. Lots of city financial geniuses that can do this. I mean, again, it's not rocket science. It's relatively easy to do. It just requires political will. And I'm afraid the reality is we're lacking leadership and political will. I mean, as I said, I talked to MPs, parliamentarians. They get it. They want to do stuff, but somewhere, it's been blocked. And there's this again. The IMF, the program as is, doesn't make sense. It doesn't add up, and it's kind of been created to sustain this myth that somehow the financing is there without the use of frozen Russian assets. It isn't, right? We have to accept the political reality that unfortunately Western taxpayers don't look like they'll pay or be willing enough to pay for Ukraine's defense. So we have to think lots of different schemes. We can think of ways to get around it, and there are definitely solutions.
In the meantime, though, and you mentioned earlier Fico in Slovakia, Orban in Hungary, we see extraordinary discontent in Poland and a blocking of the borders. This is starting to look more than just random protests. Isn't this starting to look like a concerted effort by Russia to weaponize internal domestic politics in order to shut down transportation and logistics routes into Ukraine? Essentially try to engineer a kind of siege. What's your interpretation of this, and how dangerous is it? Because it's clear that Russian hybrid aggression is only going to ramp up as it, if it can't achieve successes on the battlefield.
Look, I mean, the Ukrainians would probably accept in terms of the grain issues, etc., and the agriculture issues. They've maybe not handled it as well as they could have done, right? And there are clear issues and problems, right? I mean, you have traditional export routes for Ukrainian grain that obviously have been disrupted by Russia. Alternative ones by road or rail through Central Eastern Europe are being created. And that does create pressures in those particular countries with their farmers or their own producers. We get that, right?
But why are they not blocking? I mean, there's Russian grain in fairly substantial quantities coming via the Belarusian border. That's not being blocked. So this seems more than,
well, look,
an internal
Russia
problem.
Putin is adept at fanning, promoting, exploiting, existing fissures and divisions where they are, right? I mean, that's clear. He's loving this. And we need to be mindful of that, and we need to push back on that malign influence wherever it is from Russia. And there are solutions here, and unfortunately, I think we have a new government in Poland that I think is much more favorably inclined towards Ukraine. It wants to find solutions. I guess more tricky when it comes to the Hungarian government, and obviously we have a new administration, relatively new administration in Slovakia. Um, it's unfortunate, right? And we need to be awake to the reality that Russia is seeking to sow division and disunity and exploit these situations, right?
And there's two sort of questions there. I want to end on Ukrainian successes and turn to Black Sea grain. We'll tackle that one last. But picking up on that theme, you talked about a sort of bean counter management mindset. This also seems to, unfortunately, also be present in ministries of defense and, higher decision-making processes. From various conversations, it seems that, for instance, Biden has many instruments, many ways of not fully circumventing the blocks that are happening, in the American legislature, but there are other creative ways that could be sought to get at least essential munitions out to Ukraine. There are other ways to perhaps unlock some of the, for instance, the many, many thousands of Bradleys sitting in the desert, accumulating dust, not benefiting anyone. They'll reach the end of their lives and be scrapped. Are governments also thinking in this sort of managerial, not leadership way, and ministers of defense by not looking for loopholes, opportunities, creative ways to get stuff to Ukraine? Again, bureaucratic procedures and so on are used as a fig leaf for inactivity, indolence, and indifference, unfortunately.
Well, I think it's fundamentally it's about understanding the threat from Russia. Understanding the real and present danger, obviously to Ukraine, but also to our Western liberal market democracies. The reality that we have to win this war. Um, I think also there's been a complete misreading of Putin for many years. I think there's an overabundance of caution. If you go through through the list, you can go to T-72s, MiG-29s, S-300s, HIMARS, Leopards, long-range ATCMs or whatever they're called. I can never get the acronym right. Taurus with the Germans. In the end, there's this fear of Putin, like retaliation. And what we've learned is, he set red lines and doesn't keep them, right? I think what we should have learned is that, we have to win this war and we have to provide Ukraine with whatever it takes to win. So whatever array of conventional military kit we need to give them, we need to give them. They can do it. They can do it for us. And if the Ukrainians don't stop Putin now, we will have to stop him further down the line, right? So this is the best investment in NATO's defense it could ever be. But we need, we need also to be brave. And it's a similar story about the sanctions regime. In the end, sanctions, for sanctions to be successful, and the help and the help for Ukraine to defend itself. We have to be prepared to have some sacrifice too. There are costs on us. But the longer term costs of failing to deliver to Ukraine now are going to be much higher. This idea of an extra 1% of GDP on NATO defense spending recurring, $100 billion a year, without a doubt. So we have to deal with this now. Let's not be, Putin's a bully, is a mafia thug boss, runs his country. What we know is he respects power and he's afraid of NATO. He's afraid of a direct war with NATO. We just need to make sure we give the Ukrainians whatever they need to win this war.
And the last question, because I think you've proactively answered quite a few of the questions that I'd queued up there. The last one then is about systemic problems within the media as well, because there seems to be extraordinary coverage of even minor Russian victories, and barely any coverage of extraordinary Ukrainian ones. For instance, their ability to prevent energy infrastructure from causing major issues this winter. Big contrast to last winter. You've got freeing up of the Black Sea grain routes and the return of export volumes to near pre-war levels. And gaining a certain level of dominance in the sky and in the Black Sea area. Extraordinary successes on the part of Ukraine, which do not seem to get coverage for various reasons. One I fear is because they don't fit into the pattern or the narrative archetype that media have decided that Ukrainians are victims, and therefore it doesn't quite match with that sort of structure of thinking about news and trying to fit it into a template. But I'm not sure what your view on that might be.
Yeah, I mean, there is a narrative there now that, I mean, initially, Putin made the big mistake, went in, got his ass kicked, his forces were pushed back. And then, so the message was he's a bit of an idiot, and he's not such a great guy that many people thought he was, and Russia wasn't such a great power. Now, the resilience we've seen, now the message is, well, actually, he's in for the long game. He can last out longer than us, and we're stupid, and kind of that kind of angle. But you're right. I mean, in the end, it's still remarkable that Ukraine is resisting despite tepid Western support or limited Western support. And the Black Sea is a case in point. I mean, this is remarkable when you think about it. I mean, a country with no navy is able to dominate the Russian Black Sea fleet to the point that it's not able to use Crimea. Remember, a lot of the focus on the land corridor to Crimea was to ensure that Crimea was sustainable as a military base for the Black Sea Fleet. That land corridor to Crimea is pretty useless because Russia cannot use Crimea, Sebastopol as a naval base. It's had to move its fleet out, and as soon as its ships appear, within range of Ukrainian missiles, they get taken out. I mean, so that's an extraordinary win. A country with no navy is beating, Putin's, supposed great power naval force. I mean, so there are definite wins, and I guess it's just a shame that the war has gone on so long because we failed to provide the level of support needed for the Ukrainians to end this war and win this war. And every day that goes by, more Ukrainians die, and that's a travesty. And actually, in a way, you mentioned, I mean, the media narrative and the international media narrative, particularly in the global South, is that you can't trust the West. And I think I think that will be a pretty dominant narrative unless we do give Ukraine what it needs to win this war. And I think America's enemies globally will read, if you think of China on Taiwan and elsewhere in the world, Iran, they will read the US as unreliable, right? And that they can take advantage of US vulnerability to take their own advantage in different places like Taiwan. So it's really, really important, I think, that the West follows through on its pledges to Ukraine to ensure this war ends in the best way for Ukraine.
That's interesting, the idea that trust does not come with weakness, that in some ways you need to project strength, and that's intrinsically linked with trust as well. But this has been absolutely fascinating. I think these incredibly important topics. I really hope there are some politicians or even bean counters listening to this who can reverse some of the situation. Tim, thank you so much for appearing on the channel. Your videos always get a tremendous response from the audience. The detail, the energy, the passion. Thank you so much for being here and, of course, for being one of the strongest supporters of a Ukrainian victory.
My pleasure.